اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. I hope and pray inshallah you're well. We are on Kitab al-Buyu'. Last week we discussed an introduction to what Buyu is in this particular chapter. We looked at the huquq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We also looked at the huquq al-ibad, and we discussed the differences between the two and why the fuqaha make a difference when it comes to the principles of huquq al-ibad and huquq Allah. To follow on with that same thought, it's important and it's really interesting as an outcome, right? So when you read Kitab al-Buyu', you'll see in many places and instances that the fuqaha mention this principle called taharriyan lil jawaz, which simply refers to this idea of in mu'amalat and buyu, the fuqaha are very much looking for a way to make things permissible. And that is a result of the differences between huquq al-ibad and huquq Allah. Because we mentioned when it comes to mu'amalat, the entire idea of mu'amalat is to facilitate transactions. And that's why the fuqaha, whenever it comes in transactions, they are always looking to engineer something which works for the people. That was always the concern, that how can I as a scholar make this transaction for them work so they can fulfill their needs? Because ultimately the transaction is there to fulfill their worldly needs so that they may become focused on their other worldly needs, the akhirah goals. So it's just there to fulfill an immediate need of theirs. And so the fuqaha were very much concerned with that. And that's why the principle is called taharriyan al-jawaz. And we'll see this as we read, it'll come over and over again. But as you can see right now, we were discussing.
Give me a second.
I think if everyone can mute themselves, please. Right? We were discussing the opening. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The Musannif says, قال رحمه الله تعالى, he says, وجمع لكونه باعتبار كل من البيع والمبيع والثمن أنواع أربعة: نافذ موقوف فاسد باطل مقايضة صرف سلم مطلق مرابحة تولية وضيعة مساومة. He mentions this now. All he's doing, he's commentating on this idea of what linguistically, why the word bay, why is it made into a plural here. But what's important and what's nice here is he just gives you a categorization. And he says, look, the word or bay, buyu, has different categorizations. And each, the bay, the mabi, the thaman, each of them have further categorizations because these are the core elements of a transaction. And each of them can be divided into four. So you can analyze bay in four different ways. You can analyze the mabi also in four different ways, and likewise the thaman. And so the different categorizations or the different kind of analysis he mentions up here, that nafidun mawqufun fasilun batilun. This is in respect to the execution of a transaction. That the whole point of a transaction is what? When a transaction takes place, the entire objective is the transfer of ownership. That's the whole point. The entire point of a transaction is that there's transfer of ownership. Transfer in terms of the sale item and transfer in terms of the payment. And so when a sale is executed, that's the net result and outcome. That I become the owner of the sale item and you become the owner of this payment or this amount that's due to you. And if I don't hand it to you in the transaction, you have a claim against me. So he's saying, look, bay, if we look at bay, in terms and in so far as the execution is concerned, you could think of it in four different ways. Nafid, which is enforceable, right? That a sale will be enforceable, it's been executed, there's nothing contingent, there's no kind of suspension or nothing which has withheld the transaction from being executed. Neither is there anything wrong with the core elements of the contract or the peripheral matters of the contract. So it's not irregular either. So for all intents and purposes, the transaction is executed, it's gone through, and everything is fine. Such a transaction is nafid, right? Then it's mawquf. Mawquf, he just refers to, and it means where the transaction, insofar as the outcome is concerned, which is the transfer of ownership, that's not taken place yet, because it's pending on the ratification of the owner of the item, typically. Okay, so mawquf is when somebody, for example, just say an uncommissioned agent, what's known as a fuduli in Arabic, goes and sells something on somebody's behalf, right? And there's a whole discussion on this. Everything we're discussing on that, there'll be further discussions anyway in the book. He's just doing a linguistic kind of analysis and discussion here, but there's also some fiqh here. That's why we're just discussing it further. But when it's mawquf, it needs ratification, and therefore there's no transfer of ownership. It's withheld. So it's basically being processed. It's work in progress, more or less. And then fasid, we know, is when a transaction, it's voidable because of an irregularity in the contract. There's something irregular. There's an issue in the peripheral matters connected to the transaction. So either there's some kind of ambiguity, there's some kind of uncertainty, there's a clause in the contract which is unfair and disadvantaging one party over the other. That makes it fasid. And then there's batil. Batil refers to where there is no sale whatsoever. There is no transaction. Why? Because the core element of the contract has not been found and met. So the core requirements and requisites have not been satisfied. Therefore, there is no sale. There is no contract. Even though in Arabic we say it's bay'un batilun, it's not a bay in any way, shape, or form. There is no bay whatsoever. And therefore, there is no initiation of transfer of ownership. There's nothing. And therefore, there is no bay. So that's in terms of the bay itself. Then when it comes to mabi', he mentions that there's four types of, when we analyze mabi', there can be four scenarios. Muqayada, sarfun, salamun, mutlaqun. Muqayada is your barter trade. So in Arabic, they typically use for muqayada the word aynun bi aynin. And it's just good to understand this terminology right now. When the word ayn is used, it means something specified. Okay, that is something that's specified. Clearly, you have the item in front of you, or it's specified, it's there, you know exactly what it is. So they use the word ayn. And the opposite of ayn is dayn, debt, dayn, where it's not specified. It's something which is now a liability on the one who has to transfer it to you. That's known as dayn. A dayn is a claim, it's a liability, something which is not specified. So if I owe you, for example, £100, I owe you a dayn because it's not specified which £100. There's nothing specified or fixed. I just have this amount floating on my conscience, which is payable to you, and you have this claim directly on me. So you don't have a claim towards a particular asset, but towards myself and my conscience, and a liability that I have to perform towards you. So it's an obligation on me. So that's dayn. So muqayada refers to this barter transaction. In this barter transaction, both items are specified. That's why the fuqaha also discuss muqayada as sil'atun bi sil'atin. A sil'a is an asset which is fixed there, that's known, specified, defined, that's being traded for another asset. That's muqayada. So aynun bi aynin. Then it's sarf. The fuqaha, when you talk about sarf, they use the word thamanun bi thamanin or naqdun bi naqdin, which means that it's a payment for payment. And there's a whole chapter on sarf, but suffices right now just for us to know that it's referring to money exchange or gold and silver, right? Not just fiat currencies, because fiat currencies are a deviation from what the Hanafi fuqaha thought of money as, right? As real and true money. But more to be discussed in the chapter of sarf when we discuss money much more in depth, right? So sarf is thamanun bi thamanin. So again, it's a different type of, because we're discussing the different types of mabi' here. the mabi, the sale item, will be money, right? That's what you're buying and selling or trading and exchanging. Then number 3 is salam. When it comes to salam, the fuqaha call it daynun bi'aynin. Okay, daynun bi'aynin. So you are giving dayn for in lieu of ayn. What's the ayn here? What's specified? It's a ra'sul mal, which is being possessed by the seller. But what's dayn in salam? In salam, there's something which is outstanding. That is the sale item. Because remember, in salam, the sale item will be delivered at a future date, right? Whereas the payment, the ra'sul mal, is delivered immediately and has to be delivered in the trading session. So that's why the fuqaha call this daynun bi'aynin. It's ayn. Ayn is the ra'sul mal, the payment which is on spot and settled immediately, whereas the item for sale, or the item that's being sold, is dayn. It's not specified yet. It's not even typically existing, and it will be delivered after a certain amount of time. So that's called daynun bi'ayn. And then there is mutlaq. Then he mentions mutlaqun. Mutlaq is every other scenario, which is typically aynun bidayn, okay, where the item is specified but the money is not specified. And that's our typical transactions that take place, where whatever you're buying is specified. You know exactly what you're buying. It's defined. It's in front of you. The very item that you're buying, it's there, right? You know it. That's what we mean by ayn. We don't just mean that you know the description. So for example, if I was ordering an item from a store, just say I'm ordering 1,000 MacBooks, right? I'm ordering in a store. I'm ordering 1 MacBook. That's not called ayn yet, because the very MacBook that I'm buying and purchasing hasn't been specified yet. I'm just making an order. So that's still ayn. Because why is this so important to understand? If there was a fire tomorrow in the warehouse where these 1,000 MacBooks are held, then because I haven't specified any one item, then if there's a fire, who bears the loss? The loss will be borne by the seller, because no one item belongs to me. Rather, I just have a claim to a MacBook. So my transaction would not be cancelled or terminated because of this fire, right? Because he still owes me. I made a transaction with him to sell me 1 MacBook. And no 1 MacBook was specified for me in that warehouse. As opposed to, I went to a store, I took a box of a MacBook. I went to the Apple store. I found the MacBook. They gave me in the box. It's with me. I'm about to make the payment. Now it's just there on the verge of me making the payment, and it falls from my hand. Right? It falls from my hand. So in that instance, my MacBook is exactly specified. Yeah, of course, in the UK and other places, they would typically just replace that for you and give you something else. But from a Sharia perspective, there's a strong argument and strong case here for you to bear that loss and not theirs, because now you've taken it. And when we read about Sawm bil-Shira, we'll discuss this further. But there's a strong argument here that you would have to bear the liability and loss here. So that's the difference, and that's why this Ayn and Dayn scenario has real implications in transactions. It's not just a theoretical discussion or just a fiqh discussion. It has real implications in everyday business. And then when he finishes with mutlaqun, he mentions 4 types of sales insofar as the thaman is concerned, payment. And this analysis is based on the disclosure of profit. Okay, so when the payment is disclosed and the profit is disclosed, then there's 4 types. There can be murabaha, when there is profit. Okay, so when the profit is disclosed to the buyer, the seller says, look, I'm selling this to you with a markup of 10%. That's murabaha. Then there's tawliya, which is selling at cost price. Wadi'ah, which is selling at below cost price. And musawama, when there's no reference to the pricing or to the initial sale price. So these are the 4 kind of like ways to analyze thaman. Okay. Then he says, هو لغة مقابلة شيء بشيء مالا أو لا بدليل وشروه بثمن بخس. Okay, in Surah Yusuf. وهو من الأضداد ويستعمل متعديا وبمن. Okay, the حرف جر. And then he also mentions للتأكيد وباللام بعتك الشيء وبعت لك فهي الزائدة. قاله ابن القطاع mentions this. وباع عليه القاضي أي بلا رضاه وشرعا. So again up here he's just discussing لغة. In terms of لغة, what does بيع mean? It's simple, just مقابلة شيء بشيء, just the exchange or the kind of countering one thing with another, whether that thing is mal or not, whether it's something that you could buy or it's something which is not really a tradable item. The word bay can be used for that. And shira, similarly with the shira, these are words which are can be used for dual meanings in terms of it can be used to buy in the meaning of buying and in the meaning of selling. What's key here is, and where the fiqh really starts from after the linguistic discussion, وَشَرْعًا مُبَادَلَةُ شَيْءٍ مَرْغُوبٍ فِيهِ بِمِثْلِهِ. And this is somewhat, it's not the normal kind of, could say, the fuqaha differ in the way they describe what a bay is. They will say, some will say, mubadalatul mal bil mal. Up here, what they've said is, and what Imam Haskafi rahimahullah said, mubadalatu shay'in marghubin fihi. Something which is desirable is traded for something which is similar, right? Something which is also desirable. And that's really the definition that they are proposing for a sale and for a trade. And this is where we start unpacking and thinking of what a sale really is and what is bay. See, the asal is mubadalah. The asal in transacting and transaction is the mubadalah. It's all about mubadalah, the entire transaction. And what do we mean by that? What we mean is Islam considers a trade and a transaction to be something where value is exchanged for value. So when we say shay'in marghub, what we're talking about is something of value. So Mubadalah refers in Islam where you exchange value for value. It's as simple as that. In any scenario where there's no exchange of value, that scenario, that trade or transaction will not be valid. Because why is that the case? Value, a human being acquires, and this all goes back to the human being and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has honored a human being. A human being, he's acquired an item of value. For example, a person, he works 9 to 5 every day so hard, and he acquires that the money that he has, he earns it, Allah grants it to him. Then he goes and he buys something. Now, if he buys something which has no value, or from a Sharia perspective, it's not valued, it's not a valuable item in the eyes of Sharia, there's something wrong with that item. Then the human being, his sweat and labor, which has gone into this money that he's acquired, that has sanctity and is sacred because the human being is sacred. Allah, the Prophet has told us that his dam, his blood is sacred, haram, it's sanctified. Even his wealth is sanctified and sacred. So the very wealth and the sacredness of a human being, which is represented in his wealth, how can that be used in exchange for something which is not sacred and valuable? And therefore there's a mismatch. And the Mubadalah is about exchanging of value. And therefore, if we take a step back and even think further, the underlying principle for Mubadalah in fiqh is al-Mu'awalat taqtadi al-Musawat. The fuqaha mentioned this principle that the entire topic governing principle in buyu is this one. The entire chapter of buyu functions on this one qaida and principle. Al-Mu'awadat taqtadi al-Musawat, which means every transaction, every exchange demands and necessitates a level playing field or equal footing. Right? Every transaction demands a level playing field and equal footing. What do we mean by that? Both parties are equal. They're equal in sense of no one party has the upper hand over the other. No one party can exploit the other. no one party has an advantage over the other. They can't impose themselves on the other. And so both parties have to exchange value. They can't just, it can't be that one party is paying and the other party is not giving anything of value. So when anything diverts from this principle, the qiyas of buyu is this. And when we use the word qiyas in fiqh, it has two meanings. One meaning is the qiyas we know in usul al-fiqh, where you transmit an asal to a fara, right? Because of the illah that's found. That's the usul al-fiqh qiyas. That's not what we're talking about here. There's another qiyas in fiqh, and in Hidayah, Imam al-Marghinani rahimahullah mentions this word quite often. He says, وَهُوَ الْقِيَاسِ. What he means by that is that the logic of the chapter. Every chapter of fiqh has a pattern and logic. Whenever the mas'ala deviates from that logic and pattern, it's istihsan in fiqh. And that's why fiqh is composed of two things, qiyas and istihsan. Every chapter runs on this. There's a principle in the chapter. Every single ruling must go back to that principle. If it doesn't go back to that principle, it's because there's an istihsan, there's an exception there. But there's governing principles for every single chapter. One of the key governing principles for buyu is this, al-mu'awadat taqtadi al-musawat, which means that both parties are equal. And when both parties are equal, that's why it makes sense now that anything which creates inequality, so for example, a shart fasid, a clause which is irregular, avoidable clause, an unfair term and condition in the contract, jahala, right? Or some kind of gharar in the contract, or there's something which is imposed by one party on the other. In all scenarios, because you are upsetting and creating an imbalance in the transaction will become fasid. Because Sharia only sees a transaction as an exchange of value for value between two people who are equal. And when the two people are not equal, and one's imposing themselves on the other, there is no musawat. And there will immediately be a question of compliance from a Sharia perspective and validity. So that's the whole kind of essence. And that's why the Mubadalah is the asal. The Mubadalah determines this equality between people and the trading parties. When the Mubadalah is void of this equality, the Mubadalah itself is problematic and cannot go through. And then he mentions Mubadalah to shay'in marghub. What's shay' marghub? The fuqaha call shay' marghub, the more technical term is mal. Mal is probably the most central kind of idea when it comes in buyu, because it's a subject matter. The subject matter of trade and buyu, you could boil it down to four things. It could be mal, it could be manfa'a, it could be huquq, or it could be dayn. Or fifth, if you want to put a fifth category, it's what we call ma'dumiyah, something which is ma'dum, right? There's nothing, right? Nothingness, in other words. So there can be five things which can be traded. It can be mal, which is a property of utility. Number two, it can be manfa'a, which is typically translated as usufruct, services, or benefit. Number three, it can be huquq, meaning rights. Number four, it can be debt, dayn. And number five, it can be something which is shay ma'dum, which is nothingness, right? Ma'dumiyah, nothingness. There's nothing being traded whatsoever. When, for example, there are scenarios where nothing is traded whatsoever. For a person, he says, I'm selling you the air that's floating around me, or I'm selling you something I'm going to create next year. I'm selling you a car that's going to be invented in 3 years' time, but I'll sell it to you right now. Because that's not in existence, it's not under an istisna kind of contract or a salam contract. You're selling nothing. Or if you were to look at more kind of typical examples, some financial derivatives in the financial markets, which are not classed as anything whatsoever. You're not trading any substance or anything of value. Rather, you're just trading a number. Or Forex is another example. You're just trading a number. There's nothing that you're really trading. There's no currency in the retail kind of Forex markets that you're trading. You're rather just trading a number or trading against a number. and taking a position in the market. So you're not really trading anything, and so there's no transaction. So what is mal? Right, that's the kind of key point here, because services will be discussed, manfa'a will be discussed in ijara in detail. But what is mal? The fuqaha, when they come to define mal, they typically say two things. They say ما يميل إلى الطبع ويدخر إلى وقت الحاجة ويمكن ادخاره لوقت الحاجة. That's what they say. And by definition, mal is not understood in a silo or in vacuum, because the definition itself says ما يميل إليه طبع الإنسان. So by definition, mal is something which cannot be understood in vacuum. It's a relative concept. It has meaning to people. So mal, there's an element of mal which is understood for what it is, and then there's an element to mal in terms of what it means to people and how people assume or see that particular item. So when that's the case, okay, what does it mean by yamil al-tab' ilay? What does that mean? And so the fuqaha give several kind of examples of this, and there's typically examples that the fuqaha give to make people understand. And from the examples, what we learn, and from the writings of the fuqaha, they mention that anything which people are inclined towards, there's an inclination, or in other words, there's utility. That's the best word to use here and understand, because value is very subjective, right? What's valuable, right? Value is a very subjective term. Valuable can be, something can be valuable to me, but not to you, right? It may have no value to you whatsoever. Or an item may be valuable in one industry, but not to another. So in the medical industry, certain things will be very valuable, but in other industries, it may have no value whatsoever. So value is very subjective. Therefore, we look at utility, because if something is valuable or has value, it will definitely have utility. And utility will cause action, right? Utility will ensure that humans act and utilize that thing. So that's why the fiqh looks at utility and what humans interact with, as opposed to this kind of philosophical idea of what's value. Therefore, the debate and notion of intrinsic value, which is typically discussed in books, it's not really relevant here, because intrinsic value is a very subjective notion and idea. It's a philosophical notion and concept, very abstract. What is valuable, right? What has intrinsic value? You and I can debate all day on something having intrinsic value or not having intrinsic value. But the real point from a fiqh perspective, because fiqh is tahakkum bil zahir. Fiqh is about understanding what's happening in the world, the phenomena that we see. That's what fiqh is about. We're trying to make sense of what we see and what we experience. And in buyu, we're trying to make sense of the interactions and trades and transactions of people, and what they intend and what they're doing by the apparent transactions and trade that they're making. And therefore, when that's the case, we're more concerned with utility to understand mal. And so the fuqaha will talk about, when they mention what it is, they'll say, وَالْمَالِيَةَ تَثْبُتُ بِتَمَوُّلِ النَّاسِ. That maliyah, when you want to try and understand what something, if it's a property, if something is property and something is mal, what we need to do is look at how people are considering it, how people are using this. Are people using this, or are they not using this? And if people, when we're talking about people, how many people are we talking about? Then they say, بِتَمَوُّلِ النَّاسِ كَافَةٌ وَبَعْضِهِمْ. It's either all the people use it, or some of them use it. A few of them consider this and make use of this, because of course not every person will use every single item. And there's many other definitions of mal, like Haskafi in his al-Durr al-Muntaqa, he mentions a beautiful explanation of what mal is. It's something different to what's mentioned here, or what's mentioned in some books anyway. He mentions, for example, I'm just looking at it. He mentions that when it comes to taqawwum, okay, when it comes to maliyah, this is actually mentioned in Hawi al-Qudsi, this first definition. He mentions in Hawi al-Qudsi, ismun li ghayr al-adami khuliqa li masalih al-adami. He mentions that mal is something which is not referring to man or to humans, rather it's something which is created. It's a name for something created for the benefit of people. That's what mal is. Yeah, and then there's some other kind of similar definitions of mal. Imam Haskafi rahimahullah, actually in Dul al-Muntaqa, and this is a key point to remember, is mal restricted to something being a physical, tangible asset? Right? That's a question mark that's raised. Is mal something physical? Does it have to be tangible? Imam Haskafi rahimahullah, he did discuss this, and he mentions in his Shariah al-Multaqa al-Abhur, he mentions, وَالْمُرَادُ بِالْمَالِ عَيْنٌ يَجْرِي فِيهِ التَّنَافُسُ وَالْإِبْتِذَالِ. That mal is aynun. When he mentioned the word ayn, some fuqaha and some have understood this to then mean that it has to be something tangible. However, contemporary scholars like Muftaqi Uthmani, Hafidhahullah, and others have mentioned that no, it's not the case. There is no, if we look at the actual definition of mal, there is no prerequisite, and it can't be that it's restricted to only a physical asset, because given the kind of advancement, and this is the beauty of fiqh, that the definition of mal has been left really wide open. It's not closed in any way, shape, or form, because there'll be advancements in technology, and those advancements will reshape and make us rethink the way we define things and understand things. So they mentioned that mal is not restricted to something which is physical. It can be something which is an intangible. But the key thing to make mal intangible, right, to define something intangible as mal, the key qualities still have to be there. Two things that the fuqaha mentioned, and that's ma yamilu ilayhi tab'ul insan. There has to be some utility, right? Because humans will only be inclined to something of utility, something which has a benefit for them. Like how it's mentioned in Hawi al-Qudsi, that خُلِقَ لِمَصَالِهِ الْعَدَمِ. Yeah, it's been created for the benefits of man. But that's one thing, right? So it has to have this utility. And number two, وَيُمْكِنْ إِدِّخَارُهُ لِوَقْتِ الْحَاجَةِ. That's important. Even if it's an intangible, it must be something which is stored and retrievable. Why is that so important? That is what distinguishes mal from manfa'ah. Because manfa'ah is something which cannot be stored. Services. So for example, if I'm taking a service from you, you're a lecturer, and I've come to a course and I've paid for the course. When you're lecturing in that course, that's a service that you're delivering. But that service is not something which is stored, meaning at that time, yeah, of course it can be recorded into, and downloaded. It could be put online. That's something different. What we're talking about is the actual provision of the service itself in real time. So in real time, when you're delivering that service, there's no third entity being created. It's you delivering, me consuming. And that's why services are delivered and consumed instantaneously. There's no kind of middle asset being created that's called service, and it's there existing independently. That's why it's not possible to do iddikhar li waqti al-haja. It can't be stored or retrieved later on. A service in real time. Yeah, the CD, or if you make like a file, a data file, that data becomes mal, because that can be stored, that can be traded, that can be transferred. But the actual lecture in real time being delivered, that's a service in manfa'ah. And then what's created later on is it's mal that's created. It's data. Data is mal, because it can be stored, it can be traded. So that's what the fuqaha refer to. And that's really important, because that's what makes manfa'ah different to mal. Okay, so this is what mal is all about. So mal is very broad. Everything we see, everything we interact with, typically we interact with books, we engage with computers, phones. These are all mal, right? Whether it's tangible, whether it's intangible, as long as it's something which people are inclined towards, there's utility for people. Whether that's in all people, or some people, some industries, some sectors, some countries, some cities, some like town, people have a particular item they use. It's fine. That will be mal. And then secondly, this idea and concept and notion of having something stored, that's also very important, because that distinguishes the mal from services. So that's what the fuqaha, when they're talking about here, shay'in marghub, they're talking about this idea of something which is valuable, something which people have an inclination towards. And that goes back to the principle we discussed, that Mubadalah is of exchange of value. And Sharia only sees Mubadalah as a musawat, that the entire Mubadalah is based on this idea of musawat. And musawat means that both parties are equal. There's a level playing field. They're on an equal footing. And therefore, no one party can impose themselves on the other. No one party can have the terms and conditions skewed in their favor, and no one party can create an imbalance in the underlying transaction. Whenever that's the case, the transaction will be fasid, or it can be makruh or something along those lines. But the transaction will not be permitted to go through in that particular way. They will have to revoke it and reperform and redo the transaction. Even if a bay' fasid is executed from a fiqh perspective, the parties are required to nullify and cancel that and reperform the transaction without the fasid element, the irregular element. That's why the fuqaha even mentioned a bay' fasid is actually sinful. It's sinful to proceed with bay' fasid because you have done something which is intrinsically against the Sharia principle, and you violated the haqq of Allah here, the haqq al-shara', which is maintaining equality and some form of balance between the two parties. So this is very important. Whenever we read going forward anything, try to understand how this principle is being maintained in every single transaction and every single scenario. And you'll see whenever there's a deviation from this idea of musawat, then typically that thing is not permissible, right? And this will be the common theme across the entire kitab review. So every chapter of fiqh, just remember, every chapter of fiqh has certain principles that it's pinned upon. And those principles is the fiqh. That is the fiqh. All this is just a manifestation of those principles. And so our job is to kind of piece together these furu with those principles and understand how the fuqaha understood the fiqh, and these furu that we see of our aimma are manifestations of the fiqh that they had understood, because the law is very coherent, the law is very congruent, it's intelligible, it's meaningful, it makes sense, it's logic, it has a logic to it. There's a qiyas that runs in every single bab, and that's what we need to engage with to understand exactly what is happening. So when we read the fiqh, and so if we read something here in al-Durr al-Mukhtar and it's not making sense, or things are practiced differently, the question we have to ask is, what is meant? What's the underpinning here? What's the kind of purpose here? And what's happening here? Right? Because, for example, the fuqaha will talk about it's going to come right now, very soon. The ijab and qabul have to be in madi or hal. They mentioned this thing, or in Arabic it can't be in mudari. So how does that apply in English? It's a very, very simple example. But again, we have to look at what did the fuqaha mean by that? And do we apply the same kind of idea to the English language, where things have to be in mudari, or does it have to be in madi in the English language, or how does it work? So we have to understand deeper than just what's written. And inshallah, we'll stop here for today, and we'll continue next week. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanallah.
اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور